In many ways, we're living on a planet that is very much reminiscent of the desert that I live in. We're all struggling with basic issues of food, water, and resources. So there's a standard way of thinking about these kinds of issues. It's what's called a positive feedback loop. Positive doesn't mean good in this equation of feedback loops. If you're a fan of feedback loops, you know that positive means when you input one thing, it grows in magnitude. So the feedback loop that we're stuck in, both conceptually and perhaps pragmatically, is this, and it's been alluded to in the presentations that we've heard so far. Competition over scarce resources is relentless, expanding, likely to increase further as the pressures on those resource tables grows, and over time you wind up with this kind of downward spiral, right? I mean, think about the equation here. There's a dwindling amount of material to support human habitation in this biosphere. So the nations that have the might will seek, in the interest of national security, will seek to control and exploit those resources as efficiently and as effectively as possible. And they won't make any pretense about it. Nobody's, hiding this. Maybe a decade ago, really pre-Iraq, you really wouldn't say publicly, we're going there to take their stuff. It just wouldn't be good politics. You just didn't, there was no, you would know that every war has a resource component. Every war has a resource component. But it would be couched in terms of ideology and liberation and, et cetera, fighting communism, whatever our motif was. But the resource component was always there. Going back forever, but here we are now in a modern era where now the military strategy documents will tell you straight up that control of the world's dwindling resources is one of our primary national security interests. And we are going to use our might to secure those resources in the name of protecting our nation. It's not even subtle anymore. We did it in Iraq as kind of a trial balloon, and now we're beginning to see it as the leading edge of many of our interventions. You have generals like Anthony Zinni saying straight up, if you think the oil wars were bad, wait until you see what the water wars look like. We can get by without oil. It's not going to be easy. We're pretty much addicted to it. To wean ourselves globally off the oil economy is not going to be an easy thing to do. It's not just the cars and buses. It's our food, right? The capacity to create enough sustenance through agribusiness to feed 7 billion people is largely dependent on petroleum. Many of the products we consume are made of petroleum. Someone did a study once of supermarket food. They studied the food, the packaging, and the shelves. They're all kind of made of the same stuff. Corn and oil, with a little soy. Soy is actually expanding its influence now. So this is integral, and without it, it's going to be a very challenging world to live in. But water, sine qua non, right? Without which not. There's no life without water. So this isn't a negotiable product. Oil, could we substitute another energy resource? Perhaps. Could we get back to basic small-scale farming, urban and rural? Perhaps. Could we get by without water? No. So when we start thinking about, the recent history of humankind, rife with warfare and highly destructive warfare, start now adding in what happens if the resource that you're fighting over is absolutely essential. There is no other alternative. So these are the kinds of things that keep me awake at night, actually. But in good ways, because my sense is that, like everything we've done as a species, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is that every crisis that we confront is a real opportunity for us to get something right in the process. That's the essence of what conflict transformation is all about. It's not the eradication of, it's the transformation of this. So the input of conflict is crucial to the conflict resolver's toolkit. You don't want to eradicate it, you actually want to make positive use of it. And I think we could do the same thing when it comes to our relationship to and with the environment. So some of the things that I've been trying to trace the boundaries of in recent times have been this relationship between peace and ecology, but looking to create a negative feedback loop. Negative not meaning bad. Negative meaning that when you input a crisis, a competition, a war over a resource, the output is the opposite. It's a peaceful result instead. It seems totally counterintuitive. Kind of defies the history and analysis of warfare, both modern and even out to antiquity. How can this possibly be? Well, there are actually many reasons why, in fact, you'd be more likely, or just as likely, maybe I'll hedge a little bit and say just as likely, to have a positive outcome in a situation where people were competing over a scarce resource. Let's do this together. Like, why might that be? What might you think could be some of the just take my premise as is, suspend your disbelief for a moment. What might be the reasons why in a situation where people were, confronted with a resource scarcity, they might actually be as or more likely to cooperate rather than compete for that resource?
Share a resource rather than fight over a resource.
Because fighting over it squanders it, right? It takes a lot of oil to capture the oil in Iraq. You're losing as it's not a net gainer. In fact, oil well fires, the military's use of the resource, you actually deplete the resource when you compete over it, and nobody prospers. So there's a shared interest in preserving that so that we turn this scarcity into an abundance. Any other reasons why cooperation might be as likely an outcome as competition? You could have a situation where, there's two parties kind of intersecting around some resource, but there's another variable in the equation, right? And maybe that third variable actually brings them, the two parties that were competitors, into alignment to some extent. So there's that. There's also the idea that if you compete with, A and B compete for the resource, and A wins, then C comes in, and then A and C compete, and C, it's an endless cycle in that sense as well. Any other reasons? Yeah, in the back.
The scenario that neither the resource nor the means of extraction are privately owned, they're collectively owned.
You start to multiply, the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts when you add up the various skills that it takes for a community to actually survive.
And you're not duplicating energy. Energy can go into other resources that are very well needed industries for food or
Absolutely.
whatever.
So, you see the gist of this, right? You start to deconstruct the nature of it, and you think, okay, well, how many refrigerators does a community need? Does everyone have to have one in their house? Or can there be one that we all share? How many people have to go and procure the same thing in order for a community to survive? Well, maybe it should be a set of diverse skills that are brought to bear together to generate the necessary sustenance for a community to survive. Globally, it could be the same thing. But we've created a very monolithic, privatized model that actually makes us, very fragile. It puts us in a very dependent situation. The inputs of our lives are purely reliant upon technologies of which almost none of us can actually operate. It lends itself to a very pyramid-like social structure, economic and political structure, because we can't do it by ourselves. Partly because the world the commons has been divided and enclosed and divided into private parcels. But yet, you can see the essence of diversification coming back in, where people who are actually confronted with this reality, how do we get the things we need to survive, may begin to brainstorm ways of doing it where it says, well, I can't do it all by myself, nor should I dig the well by myself. It should be something that we do and share together. So that's one side of this, the input side. The other side is what you were suggesting, that the nature of the problems we face are so interconnected and so globalized that we can't possibly solve them on our own. We have to cooperate if we're going to get our way out of the box of climate change and loss of biodiversity and the depletion of the water table, planetarily speaking. So these suggest that there must be some kind of cooperative structure in place. It's not the old school way of doing it where one hegemon attempts to just take it over isn't going to make the change that we're looking for. The climate doesn't stay over one nation. Emissions don't stay in one place. They travel the world over. We're all connected that way. So in a strange way, the crises we face have triggered a kind of globalized perspective that may actually be an opportunity for us to enhance our capacity to understand, communicate, and cooperate. So that's pretty big picture. We don't have a lot of time. I guess, because I went last, I'll just use a little bit less time. I wanted to just suggest some of the ways that this is possible to turn the crisis into an opportunity. I'll give you one quick example. It's one that resonates for me. I have many. I've been cataloging these. That was the page I was going to bring up. It's that I've been creating a little archive of some of the articles and teachings around this subject of peace ecology. That I'm sort of, a lot of people have worked in, and I'm attempting to kind of galvanize and bring together to some degree. But an example that resonates deeply for me is something called the Acequia model. Is anybody familiar with the Acequia? Has anybody heard this word before? Acequia? Interesting.
Spell it.
Acequia. Put it online and look it up after the workshop, and you'll be probably amazed at how much is out there on this. The Acequia is a 400-year-old resource-sharing system. It exists in North America. In the United States, it's in the Southwest, basically. It's Mexico and Colorado, although it spills over a little bit into Arizona and Texas as well. Maybe a couple of examples in California. It's considered the first shared governance system in, kind of governance system that we might recognize as a modern governance system in the New World. It's 400 plus years old. It's an intersection of Arabic, Spanish, Indigenous Mexican, and Native North American ways of dealing with resources. It brings together, it's multicultural as well. It comes to the New World through Spain, which the Moors had brought to Spain first. And so actually acequia comes from al-acequia, I think is the Arabic for it. But essentially it's a system that takes water in arid regions and communalizes it. It commonizes the privates rather than privatizing the commons, if you get what I mean. And so the model is extremely sophisticated and yet completely simple and elegant. There's water nearby in a place that's arid. People together, communally, share that resource by committing themselves to the labor that it takes to create primitive ditches, irrigation ditches, to bring that water where they need it. And so over time, what winds up happening is, and there's a lot to it, I can't give you the whole story, you'll have to go and look it up a little bit on your own, but basically over time what happens is people who work together, who come out annually to clean the ditch, who meet in community meeting halls to plan how are we going to manage this resource, who resolve disputes where the upriver user is taking more than their share. Over time, they learn to build reciprocal and trust-based relationships. They function in a fairly leaderless way. They adopt a nominal mayordomo, who is more of a servant than a leader, really. Someone, maybe a respected elder, to resolve disputes and and help through thorny issues. But basically, it's a self-governing, self-managing, collective resource-sharing system that includes both hardware, the resource itself, and software, the social components that we might recognize more straightforwardly as part of the Peace Builders toolkit. Consensus decision-making, rotating facilitators, conflict resolution skills, nonviolent communication, sanctions, but reintegrative sanctions, the kinds of things that might be familiar to our world, based on the fact that they're sharing a scarce resource in a rough climate. And it's held for 400 years. Still, even despite all the pressures, encroachment from everywhere, to co-opt and privatize, take the supply away, break down the structure, legislate it out of existence, it still exists and it's thriving. I see something like that as a model that could be exported in many kinds of communities. In fact, it could be a global model if we thought about it in the right sort of way. And I wish I had more time to tell you that part, but I think we should stop and leave at least a little bit of time for some questions and answers. So thank you very much, and let's all come up with who presented and we'll talk about our stuff. So thanks.